La professoressa è arrivata ieri in Italia, quindi ha fatto delle interviste molto interessanti, tra l'altro una in particolare sul Foglio, il vostro collega oggi appunto ce l'ha appena portata e riferita, quindi vi suggerisco anche per inquadrare la figura della nostra relatrice di oggi di leggere questa intervista e la introduco brevemente appunto per voi e poi passo la parola direttamente alla professoressa Stock che vi parlerà di individual rights and gender identity. Kathleen Stock is a philosopher and writer. She's a founding fellow at the University of Austin in the US. And she works and she writes on several quite relevant and sensitive issues related to individual rights, gender identity, but not only. And today we're going to discuss this issue with you, which is individual rights and gender identity. We thank again Kathleen Stock for being here. She came already at the Fondazione Luigi Einaudi last year, and the lecture was very much appreciated and debated. So I hope that also today we will have a good discussion with her. Thank you, Kathleen, for being with us today. And please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Is this working? It's working? Yes.
It's working.
Right. Okay. So thank you for having me, and thank you to the foundation and to Emma and to the president for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. So in this talk, I've got a rough plan. I'm going to talk about what gender identity is or supposed to be. I'm going to talk about what political demands are being made on the basis of gender identity across Europe and beyond. I'm going to talk about a set of principles that were introduced in the early 2000s called the Yogyakarta principles, which set out what was claimed to be rights around gender identity. And then I'm going to finally cast some doubt on the idea that there is a right to have your gender identity recognized, as is often claimed. But before I do that, I have to explain what gender identity is because it's actually quite technical. It's quite theoretical. It's not something that you automatically might understand from everyday life. So what is gender identity? Well, the first problem is that the word gender in English is multiply ambiguous. It means several different things. And quite often two people arguing about gender are arguing past each other, each with their own understanding of what gender means. So sometimes in English, gender is just a polite synonym for being male or female, for biology, for biological sex. It's polite in the sense that people don't like saying sex because sex is also the word for sexual intercourse. So if you're trying to be polite, you might say gender instead of sex. That's the easiest version of gender. In the 60s and 70s, feminists began to use the word gender to mean something different. They meant the social norms and stereotypes around maleness and femaleness in the human race. So this is what's popularly called masculinity or femininity, but understood by these people as socially constructed and culturally relative. So femininity in one country may be different to femininity in another country. Masculinity in one country might be different to masculinity in another country. But things like, wearing makeup for women, doing the housework, liking pink things or whatever it is, that would fall under gender in this second sense. Now, also in the 60s, psychologists in America who were working with children then called intersex children. Nowadays, we might say they had variations of sexual development or differences of sexual development. They started theorizing about gender roles, which is a bit like what I just talked about, behaving in a culturally stereotypical masculine or feminine way. But then they introduced this idea of your inner gender identity, which is your feeling, supposedly, that a particular gender role fits you or doesn't fit you. So you might, as a female, have an inner gender identity that is male, in the sense that you don't think that the social norms and stereotypes around femininity fit you. You somehow feel male, even though you're not male, you're female. And equally, a male might feel that masculinity doesn't fit them, and that actually they have an inner feeling that's much more aligned with femininity. Now, if you do fall under those descriptions, a third concept was introduced. You have gender dysphoria, the idea that you feel you can feel very ill at ease with your sexed body because you feel that it doesn't fit who you really are inside, something like that. So dysphoria obviously suggests something unpleasant and stressful. So this idea that was originally introduced for children whose sexed bodies were quite ambiguous because they had genetic variations or chromosomal variations, that meant that their identity was difficult to work out. And psychologically, it was difficult for them to work out whether they were male or female, masculine or feminine. So this idea of gender identity was brought in for them, but over time, it has become extended to all of us by some philosophers and some activists. So now the idea, if I just fast forward to the 21st century, there's a set of ideas about gender identity which says we all have a gender identity. It's, as you can see from this little cartoon, it's supposed to be in your head in some way, or in your brain in some way. And either your gender identity will fit with the facts about your outer body, your sex, or it will be incongruent, it won't fit. Now, most people, it is claimed, so most males have a male gender identity, most females have a female gender identity, it is claimed. At this point in the talk, I am laying out some views that I actually disagree with, but these are the views. But a male might have a female gender identity, and if he does, then he is a trans woman. So we now need to start saying she, because as we'll see, we're supposed to recognize gender identities in a way that's more important than sex. So a male might have a female gender identity, and in that case, she will be a trans woman, even though he's a male. Or it's now thought you could have a non-binary gender identity, which is neither male nor female. So you can be biologically male or biologically female, but your identity is neither male nor female, in which case you're non-binary. And a female, of course, might have a male gender identity. And according to this new activist position, that's enough to make you trans. Just that inner state, which is incongruent with your outer state, that's what makes you trans. So this is a move away from former ideas of transsexuality, which were very much tied up with surgery and hormones and doing things to your body. Now it's just supposed to be your feeling, your inner sense, that is the thing that makes you a trans woman or a trans man or a non-binary person or not. So just to repeat that point, gender identity is what makes you trans or not. It's not surgery, not hormones. You don't actually have to do any of that stuff. It's just to do with your inner state. Now, this is a very important point. It is also claimed that you can only know about someone's gender identity by asking them. So I can't tell you what your gender identity is, and you can't tell me what my gender identity is. You can't tell from the way I dress. You can't tell from the things I say or how I move. Only I can tell you, because it's this inner feeling that you can't see. So it's detached, potentially detached from behavior, from dressing, from surgery, from anything. It's supposed to be a completely inner state. And as we'll see, I think that gives rise to a few problems when you try to put this in law. Okay, now, so that's the basic idea that we've got of gender identity. Of course, you can disagree with those ideas, and I do in many ways, but I'm just at the moment just presenting to you this new set of ideas that have got some extraordinary cultural power in some countries, and it's increasing, and they are changing laws and policies on the basis of this idea. When you meet an activist who thinks that these things that I've just said are true, very often they also think some other things are true about biology. They say things like, biological sex in humans is a spectrum, not a binary. They say there are more than 2 biological sexes. Biological sex is a social construct, and biological sex is assigned at birth. Now, all of that comes from certain kind of post-structuralist and postmodernist ideas about the relationship between language and the world, which unfortunately I don't have time here to go into, although I have written about it. But the crucial thing to understand is that these activists think that there's something problematic about saying that someone is actually biologically male or female, but there's nothing problematic about saying they have a male gender identity or a female gender identity. So they're undermining, well, on the one hand, they're undermining the legitimacy of claims about sex, and on the other hand, they are saying that there is you can replace discussion of sex with discussion of gender identity. And this thing here, biological sex is assigned at birth. This is the idea that rather than something being discovered by doctors when the baby is born, they come along, they look at the baby and they say, okay, it's male or it's female. It's somehow more arbitrary. It's supposed to be more arbitrary. This might actually not be a male or a female, even though it seems that it is. So we can, and obviously you can ask questions about that bit. So the main idea from these activists and theorists is that gender identity, this inner feeling, is or should be more important than biological sex, legally, politically, socially. And this is where a particular set of political demands will emerge. Now, it gets better or worse, depending on what you think, because not only does your inner gender identity potentially make you a trans person, if you have a gender identity that's at odds with your sex, but it's also what makes you a woman or a man. So if a male, for instance, by that I mean a biologically male person with XY chromosomes, penis, testicles, standard issue male, has an inner female gender identity, then she is both a trans woman and a woman. Because in the mantra, trans women are women. Okay, so there's a very quick move from inner female gender identity to trans woman or transgender woman to woman. And the activists will tell you all the time, trans women are women, trans men are men. They're a different kind of woman, maybe, but they're still a woman. Equally, if a female, someone like me, has a male gender identity, so I feel masculine, I feel inside that my sexed body is incongruent with my inner identity, then I am straight away a transgender man or a trans man. And because I'm a trans man, I'm a man. And as we'll see, the idea is that as soon as this happens, as soon as you announce your gender identity, you need to be recognized and affirmed in all contexts. There are also, we are told, non-binary people, as I've said, who have non-binary gender identities. They don't feel female, they don't feel male. And we are supposed to accept that they are not women or men, they are neither. So they have their own set of pronouns, they, them, in English. You're not supposed to refer to these people as he or she, they become they, because that's supposed to be gender neutral in English. So I hope you can understand that this is incredibly radical, and indeed, to my mind, nonsensical, but this is just the way the activists are saying, are going. So out of this picture has come a new set of political demands. And this is a flag that's come to symbolize these demands. It's the old rainbow flag for lesbian and gay people, and it's been superimposed with bits of the trans flag, this pink and blue thing. So the demands are incongruent gender identities should be affirmed bureaucratically. That means in terms of records. So if a child or a teenager or an employee comes to you and as a boss and says, I have changed my gender identity, I am now trans, you should change all their records to reflect the new identity. You should change their name, because they will probably have changed their own name. You should change their pronouns. You should change all forms of address moving forward. And you should obliterate any reference to their biological sex. It is also said that social or medical transition for those people who have incongruent gender identities is a human right. That's for those that want it. So social transition would be dressing as the opposite sex, whatever that means, but a man putting on a dress, makeup, a woman probably dressing like me. And for those that are in this position of having these incongruent gender identities, the state should provide the hormones, the surgery to transition them medically if they want it. However, it's not the hormones or the surgery that makes them trans or even makes them a woman or a man, it's the identity. So that's another radical departure that, as I keep saying, we're moving away from the idea of surgery to something that doesn't require surgery, although you should have it if you want it. Another demand is that gender identity should replace biological sex in discrimination law. So I don't know if you've got special laws that protect women in Italy, but you do in England. You have sex, biological sex is a protected characteristic, which means you cannot be fired on the basis of being a woman. You cannot be aggressed on the basis of being a woman. The idea is we replace those laws with laws that refer to gender identity, so that now womanhood is determined by inner identity rather than facts about your sex or how you're perceived even. Because of course, someone looking at you might not know your gender identity. That's the whole point. And now here's one of the most contentious demands. The idea is, and it particularly refers to the male sex for reasons that I think are probably quite obvious. But the demand is that anyone male who has a female gender identity, which they declare by saying, I am a woman, should be allowed to access woman-only spaces immediately, without question. Changing rooms. If they've convicted of a crime, they should go to a women's prison. If they're sleeping in a dormitory, it should be with the women because they are women. Bathrooms, and also women's only resources like sports teams and competitions, which is why you can see male people, what I would call male people, competing now against women because they are women, according to this, because they have an inner gender identity that makes them a woman. Also, wherever there's a scholarship for women or a special program for women or a system of quotas for women, males who have female gender identity should be able to access those too, which is why, again, you see male politicians speaking as women's officers or women's representatives in some countries now. And I mean, pretty much I've already implied this. This policy generally is called self-ID, but specifically it's also demanded that self-ID should be the way that you can get a legal sex change. So if your country has any kind of legal mechanism to allow people to change their sex legally, in most countries, up until recently, that involved some kind of medical oversight, that involved some psychological evaluation, some kind of background checks. It was very carefully done in some countries. That's the argument is, get rid of all those checks. It should just simply be a matter of declaration. You know, if I say I'm a man, then I should get a legal certificate that says I'm a man. And no doctor should have to look at me, no psychologist should have to evaluate me, there shouldn't be any gatekeeping whatsoever. So when you hear people arguing about self-ID, that's what they're arguing about. But that policy also extends more informally to bathrooms, changing rooms, sports teams, because the idea is roughly you self-identify or you self-ID into those spaces. Okay, so I'll keep going. These are the political demands. They're all quite radical. So another one is about data collection. So we have this in the UK as a big problem at the moment, because in the past, when you wanted to track, for instance, the economic position of males versus females in the workplace, you would do it on the basis of biology. Like, who are the males and who are the females? And are the females earning less than the males? Or is maternity impacting on their capacity to work? Now, many data collectors do it on the basis of self-declared gender identity, which means that the data is being, I would say, corrupted because there are males now in the women, and their earning power is being assessed in relation, I mean, they're just being treated like women. So that's obviously changing certain profiles, particularly where women were already in the minority in some way. And another feature of this ideology, which I won't talk about here, is that it asks us to reframe sexual orientation. So previously, quite obviously, we had heterosexual sexual orientations, we had homosexual orientations, and we had bisexual orientations, and all of those were predicated on a relationship between the biological sexes. Are you attracted to people of the opposite sex to you, or the same sex to you, or both? And this set of ideas says, no. Being gay is not about being attracted to the same sex, it's about being attracted to the same gender identity. So now, to be gay is, for instance, to be a gay man is to have a male gender identity and be attracted to the people with male gender identities. So in practice, this means that you have females who think they're gay men, and you have males who say they're lesbians. And you probably have gay males who say they're heterosexual women as well. I mean, it goes in all ways, but it just completely reframes everything that we thought we understood about human sexuality. And this has been very contentious. I mean, I won't talk about this much, but very contentious in LGBT. This umbrella LGBT is supposed to be a happy family, but if 3 members of the group feel that they've had their definition redefined and their orientation redefined, then they're not happy about this at all. And I'm a lesbian, I'm not happy about it. And the final point that I will draw your attention to is that there is an international pressure to criminalize talking therapies for people with identity disturbance and for people with gender dysphoria, because it's said that it's called conversion therapy. So it's being treated as if I have some kind of identity disturbance and I think I'm a man, or I feel like a man, and I go to a therapist and say, I think I feel like a man, maybe I am a man, and the therapist says to me, well, have you considered that there might be other things going on here, you know, you might be confused, or you might be traumatized, or whatever it is. That therapist is treated as trying to convert me out of my gender identity, and that's supposed to be bad. So conversion therapy is bad, and when it applies to gender identity, it's supposed to be bad as well, which is a very big problem with a vast number of children and teenagers who are now identifying out of their sex, because it's effectively intimidating therapists from actually having honest conversations with them about it. And in some countries, it is criminalized. So you can see that this is a big range of demands. And just in case you think it's not getting anywhere, I can assure you it is getting somewhere. And there are countries which are enacting these demands. But I will give some examples shortly. But in the meantime, you can see that I hope you can see that there is a problem with freedom of expression here straight away. So someone like me counts as gender critical. That's the term that has emerged for the beliefs that I have, in the sense that I am skeptical about social stereotypes, some social stereotypes for women and men, and I think that they are harmful for women and men sometimes. And I don't believe that gender identity is politically or legally more important than biological sex. I think your sex makes a huge difference socially to all sorts of situations, and we need to be able to talk about it. I also want to draw everyone's attention to the fact that criticism of these ideas is not criticism of trans people. It's criticism of an ideology that is being perpetuated about trans people. However, there is a great effort to shut down discussion of these issues. As you can see from this image, this was at my university where I used to work. There was a number of events, but this was the biggest one, a big protest with people holding banners with my name on them saying that I should be fired or quit, just for saying the things that I've just said, basically. Everything I'm saying now is what I would have said then. And there was a huge effort to get rid of me. There have been petitions, protests, threats, it just goes on. And I'm not the only one. There are quite a lot of women now talking about this, and some men. And they are under constant pressure they're being made to be silenced. So people have lost jobs, their promotions have been threatened, they face threats, and so on. And the automatic accusation whenever you talk about this is that you are transphobic, meaning that you have some kind of fear or disgust of trans people, that you don't like them, that you are a social conservative, you are bigoted, you don't like them, and you don't want them to succeed in life. Now, I'm not a social conservative particularly. I'm married to a woman, so I have my own, I look relatively radical to some social conservatives, but that when I say these things, inevitably you are pushed with the right. You must be on the right if you say these things, because the left have just most of the left have really gone for this in many countries. So that's the background of of gender identity and its political impact. And now I want to do something a bit more theoretical. So I want to talk about how we got here. Those are pictures of protest, as you can see. Self-ID now, my gender is mine to define. Like, I get the right to say what my identity is, you can't tell me, and so on. Now, you may not have heard of it, but the Yogyakarta principles are key in explaining how this set of ideas has become so popular. It's not the only reason, but it is there. So in 2006, there was a meeting or a series of meetings of human rights experts, gay academics, trans people, judges, a former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and so on. So the whole kind of paraphernalia of authority got together and produced this set of principles, 29 principles defining human rights based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And these principles are frequently taken as authoritative by legislators when they're formulating new laws around sex and gender. They are at the highest level, from the UN down, and governments also refer to them because they are taken to define what is referred to as international best practice. So for instance, just two examples, the Council of Europe's 2009 position paper, Human Rights and Gender Identity, cites the Yogyakarta Principles and starts with the claim gender identity is one of the most fundamental aspects of life. In the UK, there was a select committee in Parliament who made a report on transgender equality, and they recommended that the government must also make a commitment to abide by the Yogyakarta principles. This would provide trans equality policy with a clear set of overall guiding principles which are in keeping with international best practice. There's that idea of international best practice again. So how does, and they did this in Indonesia, did I say that? So that's why it's Yogyakarta. How does the Yogyakarta principles define gender identity? Well, I'm just going to read out what they say. They say gender identity is understood to refer to each person's deeply felt, internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond with the sex assigned at birth, including the personal sense of the body, which may involve, if freely chosen, modification of bodily appearance or function by medical, surgical, or other means, and other expressions of gender, including dress, speech, and mannerisms. So that's, bureaucratic language, but just note a few things. Gender identity is described as internal and felt and an experience, so it's a feeling. They say that gender identity can be expressed in bodily modification or dress, but it doesn't have to be in order to be recognized in law. And also note, I would say most problematically, that they don't define gender. So gender identity is your experience of gender, but what's gender? Is it your sex? In which case, your experience of sex is to do with your outer body. No, they don't mean that. They mean something inner that's something to do with sex, something to do with masculinity, something to do with femininity, but it's your inner experience of it. Okay, now, which principles are listed? I'm not going to go through them all, because many of them are uncontroversial, bearing in mind that this document also deals with sexual orientation. And they don't really explore the tensions between the sexual orientation and gender identity. They just don't seem to think about that. But many of these are just uncontroversial, in my view, reiterations of established human rights, for instance, those in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but emphasizing that having a non-standard sexual orientation or a non-standard gender identity does not negate that right. So, for instance, the right to life is, I think, the first one. Everyone has the right to life. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of life, including by reference to considerations of sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, I absolutely agree with that. Like, no one should have their right to life threatened because they're gay or because they have a non-standard gender identity, if they do. There's also the right to freedom from torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Everyone has the right to be free from torture, including for reasons relating to sexual orientation or gender identity. So yes, I completely agree. No one should be tortured on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. No one should be tortured, probably, full stop. However, what I want to focus on is this one, because this is, I think, the one that gives rise to, or it certainly underpins many of the political demands that I just mentioned. So this is the right to recognition before the law. So I'm just going to read this out. Everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Persons of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities shall enjoy legal capacity in all aspects of life. Each person's self-defined sexual orientation and gender identity is integral to their personality and is one of the most basic aspects of self-determination, dignity, and freedom. No one shall be forced to undergo medical procedures, including sex reassignment surgery, sterilization, hormonal therapy, as a requirement for legal recognition of their gender identity. No status, such as marriage or parenthood, may be invoked as such to prevent the legal recognition of a person's gender identity. No one shall be subject to pressure to conceal, suppress, or deny their sexual orientation or gender identity. So that is, there's a lot in that, but I want to focus on, I mean, again, you can see that they're saying this, they're detaching surgery potentially and hormones potentially and any kind of medical change to the body from your right to have your inner feelings recognized in law. But there's also this sentence, each person's self-defined sexual orientation and gender identity is integral to their personality and is one of the most basic aspects of self-determination, dignity, and freedom. Now, this starts the same way as the Article 6 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights starts. Everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law is just Article 6 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But obviously it goes on a lot more. Now, the Yogyakarta principles then make some recommendations for states based on this principle. They say that states should take all necessary legislative, administrative, and other measures to fully respect and legally recognize each person's self-defined gender identity. They should take all necessary legislative, administrative, and other measures to ensure that procedures exist whereby all state-issued identity papers, which indicate a person's gender, sex, including birth certificates, passports, electoral records, and other documents, reflect the person's profound self-defined gender identity. So change the passports, change the documents, change the birth certificates, change everything, basically on the basis of your inner feeling of gender identity. And that, ensure that these procedures are efficient, fair, and so on. So I think you can trace a line from that in 2006 to these activist demands. You know, the demand for self-ID is effectively the idea that the state should recognize your inner gender identity. As soon as you declare it, it is a profound part of who you are. There should be no medical oversight or gatekeeping to stop you being recognized by the state as the gender identity you are. And this demand that gender identities be affirmed. So the language is of recognition sometimes, but also of affirmation. It's a moral act or a morally good act to affirm someone's gender identity once they tell you. As soon as that happens in medicine, in school, in universities, in workplaces, as I say, you need to use their preferred pronouns, use their new names, use their self-descriptions of gender, change all the records, change your passport, change their passports, change their birth certificates, change everything. And there's also this demand that gender identity replace biological sex in data collection. So when we're looking at populations, we should not be looking anymore at males and females. We should be looking at self-defined males and self-defined females and self-defined non-binary people who are neither male nor female. I think also that this trajectory has led to this idea that women-only spaces should be reorganized in favor of gender identities. Because quite often, so there are various different arguments offered for why males should be able to go into changing rooms, prisons, rape crisis services, and so on, as women in inverted commas. But one argument is that, well, they're women and their identity as women should be recognized. You know, it's something undignified. It undermines their dignity to put them in the men's when in fact they are women now, so they should be in the women's. Okay, so just to give you some examples from across Europe, countries that have introduced or are right now introducing self-ID include Scotland, Spain, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Ireland. And it's also in Canada, certain states in Australia, certain states in the US. There are countries with 3 options for passports: male, female, gender neutral: Germany, Netherlands, Iceland. And if you take the UK as a case study, up until recently, it has been widely presumed that males professing or declaring a female gender identity can absolutely enter women-only spaces, changing rooms, prisons, domestic violence shelters, rape crisis services without any additional legal change. They don't have to get a certificate. They don't have to have a legal sex change. They certainly don't have to have any surgery. So for instance, in UK prisons, there are several male sex offenders, that is males who have committed and been convicted of rape, or sexual assault of women, they are in women's prisons on the basis, simply on the basis of their declared female gender identity. That is it. And in fact, there are also cases of these males assaulting women in women's prisons, as you may expect, because they are violent, unstable sexual predators. But they are in close quarters. You know, I've talked to prison governors. They are in close quarters with females, showers, you know, dormitories. They are there because they say they're women and the state treats them as women. Now, this has become an emerging scandal in Scotland. In the last few months, the Scottish government tried to put a convicted rapist in a female prison. I mean, there's others that are already there, but this was a particularly difficult case. And there was a huge public backlash, and they took this person out. But there are still others still in there. And certainly in Canada, for instance, in California, this is happening, absolutely happening. So you can see that what seems like a set of radical, to me, quite crazy ideas, it's being enacted in law. So in the time remaining, I just want to say something about whether there is a right to recognition of your gender identity. I mean, you can't just say that something is a right. You have to have some kind of theoretical basis for it, because obviously activist groups all over the world have an interest in claiming certain rights that are in their interests, but are they really rights? So if we go back to Article 3, Article 3 says, the first bit of Article 3, everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. And then they add, persons of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities shall enjoy legal capacity in all aspects of life. That bit's fine, I think. You know, that bit's fine. It doesn't say everyone has the right to have their gender identity recognized in law. It just says that people with non-standard gender identities should have legal capacity. And of course, everybody should have legal capacity if you think that this is a right. So you can accept that without it following that the law should recognize your gender identity or your sexual orientation as part of your personhood. So the question is really, is it true that each person's self-defined gender identity is integral to their personality and one of the most basic aspects of self-determination, dignity, and freedom? Because that's the bit that's doing a lot of rhetorical work in making this seem correct. And they also, the Yogi Carta principles also say sexual orientation and gender identity are integral to every person's dignity and humanity and must not be the basis for discrimination or abuse. So this is quite high-flown language. So the notion of personhood, or sometimes personality, but in the traditions I'm most familiar with in philosophy, there's discussion of personhood. Obviously, the concept of a person is one with a long philosophical history, which I couldn't hope to rehearse. But personhood is commonly supposed to be what differentiates humans from other animal species and gives us some kind of moral status and gives us moral duties or obligations to other humans based on our shared personhood. So that's the tradition, for instance, of Kant, who I will say something about in a minute. Now, in most of the traditions that I'm aware of, personhood is connected to, or supposed to be connected to, humans' rationality or capacity for rational thought. So the idea is, you know, we are not like animals, although of course you can argue that we are, but in this tradition, we are unlike animals because we have this higher cognitive capacity for rational thought, and that gives us certain kinds of abilities to choose our own lives, to be autonomous, to choose our own ends. So for instance, Kant thinks persons are rational beings capable of autonomously choosing your own life, your own ends. And rationality is the source of autonomy and also the source of dignity and requires recognition and respect from other rational beings. So when Kant talks about dignity, dignity, recognition, and respect, he is talking about rationality as the basis for this. So rights, when you think about human rights, obviously you can argue about what rights really are, but for some people, rights are protections for personal freedoms to choose, to rationally choose your own ends. So nobody should be interfering with your capacity to choose what a good life is for you. So that would be one defense of there being basic rights to life, rights to freedom from torture, and so on. So in what way could gender identity, this inner feeling of being a man or a woman that has got nothing to do with whether you are actually a man or a woman, in what way could that be integral to personhood or self-determination or dignity or freedom? I don't think it is. I don't think it can be in the same way, because, for instance, gender identity is quite clearly, I mean, first of all, not everyone has one, but secondly, people who say they have them, they change. So feelings can change, and gender identity is a feeling, so it can change. So we have a phenomenon, for instance, of what are called detransitioners. Detransitioners are people who used to think that they were trans. They used to have, they used to feel like a woman. They used to feel like a man and used to say she was a man, and perhaps has had surgery to remove her breasts or remove her womb. And now she regrets this. She thinks she was lost in some crazy ideology at the time or delusion. And now she thinks, I'm a woman. Of course I'm a woman. Woman is to do with sex, not to do with my inner feelings. And so her gender identity has changed over time. And as I just said, the other thing is not everyone has a gender identity. I know lots and lots of women who say to me, I don't feel like a woman, I just am a woman. Like, what would it be to feel like a woman in a way that wasn't just looking down and thinking, oh yeah, I'm a woman. So they don't, if some people don't have a gender identity, then I don't see how this can be fundamental to personhood. Because surely what's fundamental to personhood is something that all persons have. I mean, another aspect of this, which I haven't really gone into, is the critique that your gender identity is very probably, if you have one, based on social stereotypes. So if you ask a man who says he's a woman, well, how do you feel like a woman? They say, oh, well, I've always liked dolls, and I've always liked dressing up, and I've always liked wearing makeup. But those are not things that I do, so those are not fundamental to womanhood either. Those are social stereotypes about femininity. So there is a concern that this is quite sexist. Anyway, leaving that aside, it seems to me that since not everyone has a gender identity and they can change over time, we can't say that gender identity is integral to personhood or self-determination and so on. So what else might justify recognition of gender identity as a human right? And please note, I'm not discussing whether you should be able to express your gender identity. I'm discussing whether the state has a duty to recognize your gender identity, to affirm your gender identity, to change the documents about it, and so on. So one possible argument I can imagine people making is that it's a fundamental need. Recognition of gender identity is a fundamental human need, or it contributes to well-being, because sometimes human rights are justified in terms of contributing to human well-being or to needs. And I can imagine a trans person saying, it really, it is in my interests, my well-being, that you recognize that I am not a man, I am a woman, for instance. The trouble with this is that it seems to me it's an evidence-based claim, and so we need therefore to look at evidence. Is it true that affirming someone's gender identity or recognizing their gender identity contributes to their well-being? Apparently not always. So, for instance, with younger people who have gender dysphoria, it is often assumed without evidence that if you affirm them, this will help them. So if you treat them as the sex that they want to be, or the gender identity they want to be, that somehow this will help them. But actually, studies are now emerging that affirming someone with gender dysphoria might make dysphoria worse rather than reducing it. And there's an alternative strategy where you don't affirm, you just kind of ignore it for a bit. And it, as often adolescent issues resolve on their own. So it's called watchful waiting. You know, you don't affirm, you don't rush in to say, yes, you have changed sex, or yes, you are a man now. You just kind of try and avoid it, try and get on with other things. And over time and maturity, perhaps this will resolve. So that's one problem, that affirmation and recognition is not necessarily in the interests of young people with gender dysphoria. And here's another reason: affirmation makes it more likely that young people in particular who have gender dysphoria will go on to medical pathways. So it makes it more likely that they will take hormones when they're 16 or 17 or 18, or they will take what are called puberty blockers, these drugs that block your puberty beforehand. And then maybe they will get, when they get to the age of majority, they will have operations to remove their sexual organs or reconstruct their sexual organs. And then they become lifelong medical patients. You can't just take hormones for a week. You have to take hormones for your whole life. And these surgeries often have complications. So if we're asking whether affirmation is always contributing to well-being, I would say there are some reasons to doubt that affirmation does so. Of course, for some people it might, but we're trying to ground a human right here. You know, we're trying to find something very fundamental that's going to prop up this discussion about human rights. So the final thing I want to say before I stop is that even if it was a human right to have your gender identity recognized, I think there would still be obvious clashes with other human rights. Freedom of speech being the obvious one and relevant to me as somebody who has had my freedom of speech curtailed in various places because of these beliefs. So does your right to have your gender identity recognized by me mean that I can't name your sex? I think not. I think I should be still able to say, no, you are biologically male, you should not be in this sports team, for instance, or you are biologically male, you should not be in this prison. But if we're supposed to recognize and affirm gender identity, then a whole lot of things we normally say about biological sex no longer be said. And there's also freedom from violence. And this one's particular for women. Does your right to have your gender identity recognized by the law or the state or institutions mean that women cannot have female-only spaces where they undress and sleep? Bearing in mind that some males will always take advantage of these situations to aggress women. And that's just a fact about males. That's not a fact about trans people. That's just a fact about males. So I would say no, your right to have your gender identity recognized does not override women's right to be free from violence in intimate spaces. But those are my views. Obviously, you might disagree with me. So I think that's it. That's the end of my presentation. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. I mean, you raised so many very thoughtful and very complex issues. So even to ask questions is quite difficult in some respect. So let's see if there are questions. Should I come to your computer?
There are a couple of questions from people online.
Go ahead.
We can make them read them out loud, or we can...
they can ask questions directly if they like.
Okay.
Okay.
Qualcuno di voi vuole fare una domanda? Intanto.
I mean, I can change my, if gender is not biological sex, I can change my gender more time, 3 times,
Yes.
4 times.
Yes.
And with documents, how can, with the bureaucratic questions, how can I resolve? I can proceed.
That's a good question. Yeah. So some states have tried to build in a safeguard against too many changes by saying that, you know, you have to sign something in good faith to say that this is really your gender identity. But I think in practice, it's legally inoperable, because if we accept that gender identity, only you can know it, then we have to allow people who can be mistaken about their gender identity. So I can easily imagine someone saying yes. In fact, I know people who have changed from man to woman to non-binary to man to woman again. So yeah, it's a problem. That is a problem.
Allora, chi si è prenotato online può fare la propria domanda. Il primo prenotato è Marina Vigorito. Quando vuoi puoi parlare.
Sì, grazie mille, spero che mi sentiate. Io appunto una domanda. First of all, I would like to thank you for this very interesting discussion. I am the executive director of the International Aeronautical Federation, and we do have a problem with the self-identity for transgender, because we do not know how to place an athlete in the women's category, even because the Olympic Committee is reluctant to take a position. Mm-hmm. One proposal is to have the test for level of testosterone. Do you believe it can be a solution? Thank you.
No, I don't, is the short answer. So,
yeah,
as you say, the International Olympic Committee has effectively recently avoided taking responsibility for a decision in this area by saying that governing bodies of particular sports should create their own rules, which is very cowardly, because there's enormous amounts of evidence, overwhelming evidence, that going through a male puberty gives you a predictable advantage versus a female. You have bigger muscles, but you also have bigger lungs, you're on average taller, you have faster twitch muscles. There's just a huge number of ways in which the male, as we know, I mean, the thing is, we're pretending we don't know this, the male is differently shaped. And when you look at elite, as you know, I'm sure, if you look at elite women athletes versus elite male athletes, there's a 10% performance gap, predictably. Now, that happens at puberty. So even if you then artificially reduce a man's testosterone by some nanomoles or whatever, I can't remember exactly what they require, you, first of all, the man will still have so much more testosterone than the woman. And second of all, you cannot undo all these advantages that you were given. So there's the disadvantage in terms of speed, but there's also the danger element. For instance, in rugby, I can't remember, I think I'm right in saying that the World Rugby Association is allowing males to play rugby against women. And that's a contact sport. You can imagine, like, women are going to get their necks broken in tackling. So I think at elite level, reducing testosterone will not solve this issue. And then if we go down to amateur level, some clubs and societies and teams are not even requiring testosterone suppression. They're just saying, oh, you feel like a woman? Okay, come and join the women's team. So that's even crazier, but it's all quite crazy. So I'm sorry.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for your answer, which was expected, I see.
La seconda domanda è da parte di Roberto Penna. Second question.
Yes, hello, good afternoon. The question was, how is it possible to verify and certify the incongruent gender identity, which means it is not logically enough to affirm to have an incongruent gender identity for changing identity. I give you an example. Your approach is very much like a a Northern European approach, which means what people say is right. In Italy, things work differently. Suppose that the government issues a law that female get 30% higher wage in their work. So we will find that 30% of the people, 40% of males will change identity. So we'll say, no, don't laugh.
No, I know, I agree.
This is Italy. So this is Italy, but not only Italy, I would say.
No,
but so that must be like, since we respect different incongruent gender identity, we very much respect it. So there must be a way to assess the correct gender identity, and it is not only an external requirement, but just also an internal requirement. How can you help people to assess their own gender identity?
No, I agree with you. I 100% agree with you. And it's not just Italy, and certainly it's the case in Northern Europe that men and women will cheat. If a law comes in that says you get to decide whether you join this privileged category or not, then of course people will and are. I mean, that's what's happening in the prison system. Would you rather go to a male prison or a female prison? You'd rather go to a female prison. It's a lot easier, and you're surrounded by women, not violent men. So yeah, that's a problem. So now, my answer is you cannot verify an inner feeling. What the answer used to be that medics could assess you for gender dysphoria. And what they would do is ask you a selection of questions like, do you feel more like a man or a woman? Does this distress you? You know, do you dream of yourself as a man? Do you dress as the opposite sex? Did you like playing with dolls when you were a child? Now, honestly, I think those questions are stupid too, because I think girls can play with, boys' toys and vice versa. And I would like to be a man. Sometimes I dream of being a man, but it doesn't make me dysphoric. But, let's just say that there may be some psychological tests for dysphoria. That doesn't mean there's a test for identity. And in fact, the activists want us to get rid of the idea of dysphoria. They just want this declaration to be the only thing. So I agree with you. It's totally inoperable and will lead to all sorts of abuses of power and legal messes, because we've still got other human rights, as I've said, that will come up against this all the time. So yeah, it's a mess, and I agree with you.
Ok, Roberto Penna, vuoi rispondere qualcosa o va bene così? Passiamo alla prossima?
Yes, please.
Ok.
Go ahead.
Prossima domanda, Giovanni Luigi Fabbri.
Can you hear me? Mi sentite?
Sì.
Okay. So first of all, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I was thinking, it seems to me that this so-called gender ideology is kind of a
no, purtroppo Giovanni la sentiamo molto disturbata.
Yeah, immagino, sono in un po' chiuso, per questo avevo scritto, perché è stato questo più facile.
Preferisci che la leggiamo noi? Ok, passiamo alla prossima, poi torniamo a Giovanni. La prossima è di Andrea Marchionni.
Grazie, mi sentite? Un po'.
Sì, prego, Andrea.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, but I feel a great discomfort to listen to this kind of things that are going on in this human rights or pretending to be human rights that I really don't understand. So I completely agree with you, your position. And I wonder if people that are against this ideology, it's okay to contrast this ideology on academic basis like you do, because of course it's okay to discuss, but I feel like to be more efficient is it's time to be a bit more stark. I mean, to have I feel bad for this, but this is why many people vote more extremist parties.
Yeah.
You know, I do. I mean, I'm an exponent. I'm a political. I'm a politician, and this is one of the reasons. I would like to be really a freedom bishop, but really it's difficult in this kind of world where when people ask for some rights, quotes, they don't ask, they want them. If you don't give them, you're a fascist, you know.
Yes. I think I find it very challenging. So I think sorry, I find it frustrating. I would say I was on the left, and obviously I am gay, so I can see how the right wing is using these radical ideas and these policies as a way of building support on the right. And meanwhile, on the left, people like me are being criticized heavily for drawing attention. I mean, for a start, they would say, oh, this is all made up, all lies, you know, it's all fine, there's no problems, you know, they just don't want to know. So I'm stuck myself between a right wing, a far right, a growing far right movement that really wants to take away, you know, that don't like lesbians and don't really like women.
Okay.
And also don't really like women, you know, having non-traditional ways of life generally. So, and my fear is that governments like Orban, Erdogan, and maybe even Meloni are going to use these examples to push back against women's rights, gay rights, lesbian rights, and so on, and trans people's rights. I mean, you know, I think trans people should be protected from discrimination. I just don't think it should be through the mechanism of gender identity. So for myself, I feel that I have a responsibility to try and keep the center ground, what I think is the center ground. You know, I do think there should be protections for gay people, trans people, women, but not in terms of inner feelings, and not in a way that, well, it's just crazy for me. I think it's crazy. So, but I understand why it's pushing people to the right. I do.
Of course. Thank you very much.
Okay, there is the question from Giovanni Luigi Fabbri. He says, it seems to me that gender ideology is a kind of modern day hermeticism, in that one's inner true self is somehow trapped inside a material shell which one wants to transcend. I was wondering if she would agree.
Yes, and I think it has, I mean, symbolically or metaphorically, gender identity ideology is reminiscent of Platonism, it's reminiscent of Christianity, you know, it's reminiscent of Cartesian dualism, you know, the inner, it's a way of trying to address deep philosophical questions about the relationship of consciousness to the world and the soul to the world. And it is striking that it's almost a move back to medieval ideas of gendered souls being completely detached from bodies. So yes, I think it's fascinating in that respect. And there's also there is a strongly religious element. It's like a new kind of religion. We have these kind of sacred texts that you cannot argue with. You have priests, you have special outfits, you know, you have a whole Pride Month. I don't know if you do Pride Month, but we have a whole month of Pride, and then we have special days, Transgender Day of Visibility, Transgender Day of Remembrance. There's all these ceremonies. There's this very liturgical kind of aspect to it. It's very attractive to people, I think, as organized religion in the North, at least, is dying. So, yeah.
Ok, ci sono altre domande? Any other question? No? Ok.
A couple of questions. Actually, one question of clarification and one general question. So you mentioned before that the category, let's say, of gender neutrality in documents, for example. So, but gender neutrality does not really represent the gender identity in clear terms, in the sense that what does it mean, gender neutrality? That what is, you know, certified, let's say, through that category?
Well, in some cases, it was brought in arguably to fit the gender identities of non-binary people.
Okay, so like a fluidity?
Yeah, well, non-binary people are, it's usually defined as you are either neither a man nor a woman, or you are both. The thing is, another aspect that I didn't really go into because I didn't have time is that people who have genuine variations of sexual development, that is intersex people, you know, people born with chromosomal abnormalities or endocrinological abnormalities who can have, so for instance, there can be females with very virilized bodies, and there can be males, XY chromosome, with who cannot respond to testosterone, so they develop breasts and vulvas, and they have internal testicles. So, you know, there's complicated bodies for a very small number of people, and sometimes in some countries, gender neutrality is brought in for them, but then it is opened up for non-binary people who are just people like you and me, but who don't feel like we're men or women.
Okay, and now in the other comments, so I was thinking when you were talking that in Italy, but not only in Italy, in Europe, I would say, we're still, I mean, governments are still promoting social cohesion, and one of the big issue referring to social cohesion is the reducing gender gap, and, you know, increasing the equal opportunity between men and women in politics, in economics, in the business world, etc. So my feeling is that, I mean, on one side, Europe is still, you know, in Europe, but not only Europe, but in Italy especially, we're still discussion and debating in the political debate about, you know, rights and opportunities for women and men. And so how could you relate this debate and the need to equalize, or at least, I mean, to reduce gender gap in several aspects with the issue that you raised today?
Okay, so I will answer that directly, but I just want to say that this word gender is particularly dangerous, as particularly where English is the language that's being spoken across the bureaucracy of the European Union. If English is being used and the word gender comes in, when they say gender pay gap, they mean sex pay gap. They mean women go on maternity leave or they have babies, and this affects their capacity to earn. And that's nothing to do with gender identity.
No, not at all.
It's nothing.
It's biological.
It's biological. However, this word gender disguises that, and then in all sorts of EU documents and position papers, including the women's lobby at the EU, they are now starting to confuse gender in that sense with gender identity, and all these gender identity policies are being adopted by women's groups, you know, so it's crazy. But how these two things interact? Well, I would say, you know, I'm a liberal, I'm on the left, so I think sex equality is a good thing, including in terms of earning power. And I would say that I prefer a world in which women are free to do what men can do, largely speaking, as long as we're talking socially. Obviously, biologically, there's differences. So I would say that the gender identity ideology is actually quite sexist, because it seems to suggest that like womanhood is the same thing as femininity. And I don't like that. However, I would also draw your attention to some conservative thinkers that I know who say that feminism started all this. Feminism started downplaying the relationships between men and, the differences between men and women. And now we have a generation of young people who think there are no differences between men and women. And so I don't think that's true, but I do think that at times feminism has not been clear enough about the biological basis of difference. And feminism has often sought to downplay biological difference. So we shouldn't have done that.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so if there are no other questions? No, okay. Okay, so thank you very much for being with us tonight. I think that we are still going to think about it, because actually the issue is very, it's very sensitive, it's quite complex, and so I think that we still reflect on that, and we really thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you for the good questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.